Liddy, Chapter 3, Cutler's Tavern. Liddy stood outside the gate, waiting until Luke and his wagon disappeared around the curve of the road. Then she watched a pair of swallows dive and soar in the huge chimney in the center of the main house. The tavern was larger than the Stevensons' farmhouse. Addition after addition, porch, shed, and a couple of barns, the end one at least 4 stories high. The whole complex, recently painted with a mix of red ochre and buttermilk, stood against the sky like a row of giant beets popped clear of the earth. The pastures, a lush new green, were dotted with merino sheep and fat milk cows. There was a huge sugar maple in the front, which must have been the parlor door, and another at the porch, which, from the presence of the churns and the cooling pads, must lead to the kitchen. Once I walk in the gate, I ain't free any more, she thought, no matter how handsome the house was. Once I enter, I'm a servant girl, no more than a black slave. She had been queen of the cabin in the straggly fields of the sugar bush up on the hill, but now someone else would call the tune. How could her mother have done such a thing? She was sure her father would be horrified. She and Charlie drudges on someone else's place. It didn't matter that plenty of poor people put their children for hire to save having to feed them. She and Charlie could have fed themselves. Just one good harvest, just one good sugaring, that was all they needed, and they could have stayed together. She was startled out of her dreaming by a hideous roar, and before she could figure out what animal could have made such a noise, a stagecoach appeared, drawn by 2 spawns of sweating Morgan horses, shaking their great heads, showing their fierce teeth, saliva foaming on their iron bits. The coach had rounded the curve, its horn bellowing. The driver was yelling as well, and then, just in time, she realized that he was yelling at her. She jumped hard against the wall. He was still yelling back at her as he pulled up the reins. The coach itself, now on the very spot where she had been standing seconds before. Should she apologize? No, he wasn't paying her any attention now. He was turning the team over to a boy who had run out of the shed. A woman was hurrying out of the kitchen door to welcome the passengers who were climbing stiffly from the coach. Liddy stared. They were very grand looking. One of the gentlemen, a man in a beaver hat and frilled shirt, turned a hand to a woman down the coach step. The lady's face was hidden by a fancy straw bonnet and the brim decorated with roses that matched her gown. Was it silk? Liddy couldn't be sure. She had never seen real silk dress before, but it was smooth and pink, like a baby's cheek. Around her shoulders, the lady wore a shawl woven in deeper shades of pink. Liddy marveled that the woman would wear something so delicate for a ride to the Northland in a dusty coach. Safely on the ground, the woman lifted her head and looked about her. Her face was thin and white, her features elegant. She caught Liddy's eye and smiled. It was a very nice smile, not at all haughty. Liddy realized that she had been staring. She closed her mouth and quickly looked away. Then the encounter was over, for the stout woman who had come out to the kitchen door was hustling the lady, her escort, and 2 other passengers through the low gate and around to the main door at the north end of the tavern. Suddenly she saw Liddy. She came over to the wall and whispered hoarsely across to her. "What are you doing here?" She was looking Liddy up and down as she asked, as though Liddy was a stray dog who had wandered too close to her house. Liddy was aware, as she might not have been minutes before, that she had no bonnet and that her hair and her braids were dusty from the road. She crossed her arms, trying to cover the worn brown homespun with the gunny sack. The dress was tight across her newly budding chest, and it hung unevenly to just above her ankles in a ragged hem. Her brown feet were bare. Her outgrown boots were still slung over her shoulder. She should have remembered to put them on before she got off Luke's wagon. Self-consciously, she raised her sleeve and wiped her nose and her mouth under the woman's unforgiving stare. "Go along," the woman was saying. "This is a respectable tavern, not a township poor farm." Liddy could feel the rage oozing like a sap on the March morning. She cleared her throat and stood up straight. "I'm Lydia Worthen," she said. "I got a letter from my mother." The woman looked horrified. "You're the new girl?" "I reckon I am," Liddy said, clutching her gunny sack tightly. "Well, I've no time to bother with you right now," the woman said. "Go into the kitchen and ask Tryphena to tell you where you can wash. We keep a clean place here." Liddy bit her lip to keep from answering back. She looked straight into the woman's face until the woman blinked and turned running in a little to catch up with the guests who were waiting for her at the main door. The cook was as busy as the mistress and not eager to involve herself with a dirty new servant just when she was putting a meal on the table. "Sit over there." Tryphena shook her head at a low stool near the huge fireplace. Liddy would have rather stood after a long, bumpy ride in the Stevensons' wagon, but she chose not to cause a problem with the cook as well as with the mistress in the first 10 minutes of her employment. The kitchen was 3 times the size of the whole Worthern cabin. Its center was a huge fireplace. Liddy could have stretched out full length in front of it, and her head and toes would have remained on the hearth with room to spare. Built into the right side of the brick chimney was a huge beehive-shaped oven, and the smell of fresh-baked loaves made Liddy forget the generous dinner she'd shared noontime. The trouble with eating good, she thought later, is you get too used to it. You think you ought to have it regular, not just for a treat. Over the fire hung a kettle so large that both the babies could have bathed in it together. It was bubbling with meat stew, chocked full with carrots and onions and beans and potatoes and a thick brown broth. There were chickens turning on a spit, which seemed to have magically going round and round on its own. But as Liddy's eyes followed the leather strap upward, she saw above the fireplace a mechanism from which hung a huge metal pendulum. She wished for her father to see it. He could make one, perhaps, from wood, and then no one would have the tedious turn the spit by hand. But perhaps it was something you'd have to order from a blacksmith, in which case it was likely to be so dear that only the rich could afford one. She couldn't remember seeing one at the Stevensons, and they were rich enough to own their own loom. "Move," the cook said. The large woman was beginning to take the food from the fire. She gave Liddy a quick glance. "You're so plain. Guests couldn't leave the last girl be." She was ladling stew into a large serving basin. "Wouldn't have no trouble with you, will we?" Liddy picked up the stool and moved it to the corner of the room. She knew she was no beauty, never had been, but she was a fierce worker. She'd prove to that woman. Should she offer to help now? But the cook was too busy moving the food from the fire to the long wooden table in the center of the room to pay her any mind. Liddy scrunched her body into itself and tucked her bare feet under the low stool, fearful of seeming in the way. Would all the guests come in here to eat? And if so, where should she hide? As if to answer her own question, the mistress pushed through the door with the boy behind her. "Hurry," she said. She supervised while the last of the food was transferred from the iron kettles into the great china basins, which the cook and the boy carried from the kitchen to some other part of the house. The mistress mumbled and grumbled orders, and in between complained of the guest who made herself out to be a lady when she was nothing but a factory girl putting on fancy airs. If the mistress saw Liddy sitting in the corner, she never let on. Liddy was glad to be ignored. She needed time and a chance to wash and change her dusty clothes. If only she hadn't worn her better homespun to travel in. The one in the gunny sack was even tighter and more ragged. She hadn't had a new dress since they sold the sheep 4 years ago. Since then, her body has begun to make those strange changes to womanhood that exasperated her. Why couldn't she be thin and straight as a boy? Why couldn't she have been a boy? Perhaps then her father would not have had to leave. With an older son to help, maybe he could have made a living for them on the hill farm. But, hard as she wished, hard as she tried, she was only a girl. She was, as girls go, scrawny and muscular, yet her boyish frame had in the last year betrayed her. Her breasts were small, and her hips were slightly curved, and she couldn't help resenting these visible signs that she doomed to be a female. Even in the last year before Papa left, he begun sending her in to help her mother. She never really got over the baby's birth, he'd say, but once there was no more wool to spin. She felt as though her presence in the house just made her mother try less. One by one, the household tasks had begun being turned over to Liddy, cooking and turning and cleaning and caring for the babies. For a while, her mother spun the flax. They had no loom and had paid the village weaver and spun flax for cloth. Her father had left them a new shirt for her father had left them in a new shirt her mother had made, but that was the last garment her mother sewed. Liddy tried to keep up the spinning, but when she had to take her father's place outdoors, she was too exhausted to try to spin and sew in the dim candlelight. Last winter she sewed one shirt. She had made it for Charlie because he too was outgrowing his clothes, and the old wool shirt their father had left behind hung on him like a nightdress. As it turned out, Mistress Cutler provided her with a store-bought calico gown. It was softer than her rough brown homespun and fit her much better, but somehow it suited her less. How could she enjoy the garment of her servitude? She was fit with new boots as well. They pinched her feet and made her long to go barefoot, but she wore them, if not meekly, at least with determined obedience. After a few weeks and many blisters, they softened a little, and she was able to forget them for an hour or so at a time. The people at the Cutlers were not so easy to forget. The mistress was large in body and seemed to be everywhere on watch. How could a woman so obviously rich in this world's goods be so mean in the use of them? Her eyes were narrow and close, and always on the sharp for the least bit of split flour or an odd crumb on the lip. Not that Liddy would stoop to steal a bite of bread, but the boy, Willy Hyde, was given to snatching the last of the loaf as he carried the bread basket from the table to the kitchen. He was a year or so older than Charles and growing like a red birch, and to hear the mistress carry on about as useless. He was sent to the shed or barn or field whenever he was not needed in the tavern itself. Liddy would not have said so, but she envied the chance to be outdoors and out of boots so often. Mistress Cutler watched Liddy like a barn cat on a sparrow, but Liddy was determined not to give her cause for complaint. She had worked hard since she could remember, but now she worked even harder, for who was there to share a moment's leisure with? Who would listen with her to a bird call, stare at the sunset, or watch a calf stumble on its long, funny legs towards its mother? Missing Charlie was like wearing a stone around her neck. She slept under the eaves of the windowless passage, which was hot and airless even in the late spring. She was ordered to bed late and obliged to rise early, for the mistress was determined that no paying guests in the windowed rooms across the narrow passageway should know that they shared the floor with the kitchen girl. She spoke rarely, but she listened intently, storing up stories for Charlie. She didn't consider writing him. She was ashamed to have Charlie see her poor penmanship and her crude spelling, and besides, there was no money for paper or postage, nothing except the calf money, and she would not spend a halfpenny of that. Indeed, at night, when she was so tired or too hot to sleep, she would take the gunny sack out from her straw mattress and count the money in the darkness. "It's like little Agnes sucking her thumb," she scolded herself, but she didn't stop. It was the only comfort she had that summer. It was nearly September when she saw the pink silk lady again. She had come this time on a coach from Burlington and was headed, Liddy overheard her say at supper, for Lowell, Massachusetts. When another traveler asked her business in Lowell, she smiled and said, "Why, I work in the Hamilton mill there." "Yes," she added, answering the questioner's stare. "I'm one of those factory girls." The man murmured something and turned his face towards his bowl of stew. The lady watched him, still smiling, and then, catching Liddy's eye, smiled even more broadly, as though to imply that Liddy was a comrade in some particular way. Indeed, when the men had left the dining room to go into the tap room, she stayed behind, reading a book she had taken from a small silk purse that matched her lovely dress. "I've seen you before, haven't I?" Liddy looked around to see whom the lady was speaking to, and then realized the room was empty except for the two of them. "In late May, when I was headed home to the farm for the summer." Liddy cleared her throat. She had lost the habit of conversation. She nodded. "You're not one of the family here." Liddy shook her head. "You're a good worker. I can see that." Liddy nodded again, acknowledging the compliment, and turned again to loading dirty dishes in her tray. "You'd do well in the mill, you know. You'd clear at least $2 a week, and," she paused, "you'd be independent." She was lying. Liddy was sure of it. No girl could make that much money in a week's time. "It's hard work, but maybe easier than what you do here, and you'd have some time for yourself to study or just rest." My mother's promised me here, Liddy said quickly because the door from the kitchen was moving and suddenly Mistress Cutler was in the dining room. The woman looked at the lady and to Liddy, opening her mouth to speak, but Liddy didn't wait. She hurried past her into the kitchen. That night, again, she counted the calf money. The lady had been lying, of course, but still, how had a farmer's daughter bought a silk dress?